at the Driskell Center in honor of David, beginning with a virtual exhibit of his archives, the David C. Driskell archives. Of course, you're aware of the student exhibition that we have up presently that we'll be referring to tonight. We had other kinds of virtual events. We had a visit by the Links that had a chance to view the student show, and even have one of the artists in the show hosted with us, which was great. So it's been very exciting, a sad reason, of course, for so much programming, but a celebration, I think, of David's legacy, which has other institutions have also participated in. The University of Pennsylvania hosted an event, the National Gallery, of course, the Phillips Collection, and just recently, Howard University Art Gallery hosted a memorial event. We actually have one happening on Saturday at the Stephen Thomas Museum of Art in Buckhead, Georgia, near David's hometown, Eaton, Georgia. And they've had about 200 students come in from the Eaton, Georgia school system to participate in to create works of art inspired by David's work. So it's been an ongoing celebration and recognition of his great significance. I do want to announce that I'm doing a talk on April 15th, the Porter Colloquium Distinguished Lecture talk that we host each year at the Driskell Center. I'll be doing that, and that talk will focus partly on David's work and my collaboration with him, but even beyond that, I'm discussing David as a model for the future for artists, as both artists and scholars and advocates of their own works. So I'm looking forward to that argument, that presentation. I hope I get some challenges in the audience. On the 20th of April, there'll be a special evening event, I think at 7 p.m., a dialogue between myself and Dr. Pines, the newly selected president of UMD, who also had a friendship and was a colleague of David's. We're going to talk about David's legacy as a central part of his inaugural event, which is a fantastic thing. And many of you might know that DeReed has organized an exhibition of David's work in the presidential home on campus. So David is everywhere, as he should be. And of course, we know the Hyde Museum exhibition has been very successful and well received, and it'll be traveling to the Phillips and then on from the Phillips to Portland Museum of Art. And I just got a call from Portland about doing a discussion about one of the pieces from the collection. I think they've invited about 25 different individuals to reflect on one of David's paintings for the exhibition event. So most of you are well aware of the Driskell Center. I've always seen you at the Driskell Center, many of you, and we are celebrating our 20th year. 2021 will be 20 years of existence for the Driskell Center. And as you know, it is the most important cultural research arts center in the entire country. We all know that, right?
Absolutely.
At least in my mind, it is. I hope it is at everyone else's. But what is also really has been central to the celebration of David has been his mentorship and his connection. We did a panel discussion with participants in the student exhibition, and it was kind of amazing because they reflected on their relationship with David. And many of them, of course, were in their 70s and 80s and talking about David as a teacher. And we sometimes forget that he was a very young professor. I think his first appointment was at 24 years old as a professor, and his classmate, the students in his class were maybe 18, 19, 20 years old. So it was a kind of amazing. But he behaved in a very mature way and very supportive. And what has come through constantly, two things for me, is passion for embracing everyone as they were and from where they were situated, teaching from where they were at rather than where he was located. Another thing that I think has been amazing is everyone has a story about their relationship with David. So it's not just that we have the same relationship with David, they're nuanced, they're very special, and he made all of us feel, including myself, that we were the only one in the room and that he was paying close attention to us. And I think that is amazing and a testament to his sense of humanity and devotion to all of us and his love for us. You know, I often say that David loved us all and we all love David, you know. So with that, I'd like to give you a chance to talk about your relationships with David, but as well in the context of him being your mentor, being a teacher, and inspiring you to pursue your profession and your career. And then hopefully a little later on, we can talk about the art world in general, his impact, your perspectives on the art world, especially in the context of what David has established for us as a foundation and where we are today. So let us begin with Adrienne doing an introduction of herself for everyone, and we'll just go down the list.
Okay.
Adrienne?
All right. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Curlee and Dorit and everyone at the Driskell Center. I miss you all. So currently, I'm Adrienne Childs, and I'm currently a senior consulting curator for the Phillips Collection, where I will be coordinating the David Driskell exhibition as it comes through. And I'm associate of the Hutchins Center at Harvard and an independent scholar and curator. I graduated from University of Maryland Art History and Archaeology Department in 2005, when I received my PhD in the history of art. And I met Driskell in 1980 or 78 or 79, but I didn't really start working with him until 1996. And I worked with him consistently from 1996, basically until he passed away last year. And I worked with him mostly on curatorial projects. He was mentor to me. I never took a class from him, but he sat on my dissertation committee, et cetera, and advised me on my work. But in terms of the kind of work I did with him, I was on the team that curated his exhibition, the exhibition of his collection while I was still a student, Narratives of African American Art and Identity. And as well as later on, he brought me on after I graduated, and brought me on the team to curate Conversations, African and African American Artworks and Dialogue from the Bill and Camille Cosby collection. So I was on that team. And I also curated in the meantime several shows of his work. Echoes, The Art of David C. Driskell, Evolution, 50 Years of Printmaking, and co-curated Creative Spirit. And the last thing I will say is that the subject that I work on with his influence really is African American art and European art and their intersections and issues of race and representation. So that's a little bit about me.
Excellent.
Mhm.
Matthew?
Hi, I'm Matthew Clay-Robison, and I'm the gallery director at York College of Pennsylvania. I graduated with a Master of Fine Arts from University of Maryland in 2003, along with my good friend Jefferson Pinder. I was Dr. Driskell's graduate assistant during my final year, and spending time with him in his home and studio, cataloging his correspondences and printing his woodcuts were among the most valuable experiences of my entire life. As an artist, I am mainly a printmaker, particularly woodcut, and my work has long been dominated by social justice concerns. Thank you for having me on this panel.
Excellent. To Emily.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here. My name's Emily Conover. I work at the University of Maryland right now since 1999. I'm a senior lecturer and I'm the advisor for students in the Department of Art. I graduated, actually I have a second undergraduate degree, which was in 1997 from the Department of Art. I took several classes with David. It was African American art theory and a methods and materials course as an undergraduate. And then I received my MFA in 1999. And I worked with him as a graduate student as well. Currently, I teach painting and drawing, and social justice concerns definitely are incorporated into my work as well.
Excellent. Tuliza?
Hi, my name is Tuliza Fleming. I am the interim chief curator of visual arts at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. I went to the University of Maryland. I got my master's and PhD from the school in art history, American art history. I first met David, though, when I was a college student at Spelman. And because of him, I decided to go to University of Maryland. He lectured to the school and I attended, and I was very, very impressed. I asked my head of our art department where he works, and he told me, and I put in my application when it was time to apply to graduate school. I studied with David. He was not in the art history program when I arrived, but I did take a class or two from him. And he was my mentor, as he has been many, many people's mentor, but eventually he became my friend. So although we did not work together later on in my career, we were great friends and considered him family. Thank you.
Excellent. And I think the next is Jefferson.
Hey, hi. My name is Jefferson Pinder. I'm a professor of sculpture and at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I graduated in 1993 with my bachelor's in theater, and in 2003 with an MFA in painting. And so now I'm here. I had incredible experiences with Dr. Driskell. He was my mentor. I had no idea how, big of a influence he would have on my life. I took, at first, a drawing class with him, just drawing, I think 101. It was like the basic, I think it's drawing 110. And then I took another drawing class with him. And then I took African-American art history with him, art history and theory. And later on, after I graduated, I started seeing his name everywhere. And I realized how electric his reputation was outside of, the University of Maryland. And so when I came back to Maryland after spending some time out west, I asked Dr. Driskell if I could help him in his studio. And so I was his studio assistant in the early 2000s. So that was my privilege. Great to be here today.
Ellington.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. I met Driskell at a dinner in 1996 in New York. And then I stayed in touch with him. And at that time I was at Morehouse. I was an English major. I was not even going into art, but I was doing art at the same time once I graduated. And he insisted that I come to University of Maryland, which I did. And I graduated in 2008 with my MFA in painting and mixed media. And while I was there, I was a GA for the Driskell Center and for Driskell Center from 2006 to 2007. Ended up working with Jefferson Pinder, who led my dissertation, and met him through Dr. Driskell. And I worked with Dorit and Dr. Childs, all through Dr. Driskell. So just so happy and fortunate to work with such a hero of mine, no question. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I have a few questions, but only a few, because once we start our discussion, I'm sure others will become obvious to us. What I want to start with is a question to each of you, the same question. When you think about what you experienced with David, either as a teacher or a mentor, what are the kind of lessons or the model that he presented to you that stands out today and has been continued with you as a reference or an inspiration, something that has been sustained from that experience? Can you speak about that? We'll just start with Adrienne and go down the list.
Okay, well, like I said, we worked together as curating, and I didn't really know how to curate when I was a graduate student. But he said, "Come on and curate my show." So he had the gut instinct to just hand me over his entire show to curate for the first time ever. So trusting my gut instincts and not being afraid to pull somebody new along and into what you're doing. Now, actually, I had curated an exhibition before, but you know what, I'm exaggerating. And to understand that curating, I think, is a creative process, and to lean into it like that. And also, one thing that I noticed that he did all the time was participate. He's a participator, meaning he goes to conferences, he does talks, he goes to openings, he socializes. I mean, he's in the mix. And that is so important I think, because I know curators who don't do that, and then, but I saw him, he met people, he knew people, he established relationships with all different kinds of people, didn't, just stick to, one table in the cafeteria, all the kids, he went around and he established these relationships, and it not only helped his career, but it was just a part of the way to invest yourself in this field is to be involved in it, both personally and professionally. And I'm a social person, and so I adapted to that really well. And I appreciate that. You could always count on Driskell to show up, and I feel like that is something that's important, a part of my career, to show up for my colleagues when I can, when I feel.
That wasn't just a personal principle of David. That was a strategy also, a
Right.
professional strategy, you think?
Yes, I
Good.
think so. It was a strategy, but he liked it. I mean, he wouldn't have done it so much if he liked it. I mean, he came to a talk I gave in Italy. It's all of a sudden, I mean, I knew he was going to be around, but he would just always show up.
Mm.
I think it is an important way to think about your career as being part of, intertwined with others around you, and you're not so isolated.
I've
So-
heard this from others speak about who were students of David's early on, who talked about his accessibility
Mm.
and his nurturing and his speaking to you privately and suggesting that you can do this, that you have the capacity to do this, that everyone should have an opportunity to do this. And I've often thought that that was not only an expression of his value,
Mhm.
but something that he was also told that
Yeah.
he could do it.
Yeah.
And he saw the fruits of that. Matthew, can you speak a little bit about what lessons you might have learned from that you continue right now as principles that you saw with David, or practices?
Well, excuse me, I would echo what both of you just said. When I think of him, I just think of a kindness and a generosity, and how he would make people feel like they were the only person in the room, and have a respect for everyone who was in the room. There wasn't a hierarchy of like, this person's important, this person is less important. He seemed like he treated everyone with respect. And that idea of showing up for things that Adrienne just mentioned, when I had him as a guest down at University of North Florida, I had an exhibition of his work with Jefferson's work, actually. And I asked him if he would speak at a HBC, Edmund Waters in Jacksonville while we were there. And I didn't know that they wanted him to give a talk, but as we entered the space, the host handed him a microphone and said, great, take it away. And he just gave the most profound, moving sermon right on the spot. He had no idea that he was expected to do this. And so there's a certain grace and wit that he has as well that I deeply admire. And when he was finished, I said, I didn't even know they were going to ask you to do this. Did they communicate with you directly? He said, oh, no. When you do this as much as I do, you're ready for things. And so there's so much that I wish I could download from Dr. Driskell and be able to achieve. But those are some of the things that grace of rolling with it and being in command of yourself, but also the respect that he had for everybody in the room and how he could make everybody in the room feel like they were special to him.
And David was, I believe, was always prepared. We talk about his scholarship and his writing and his curatorial practices, but I don't know if enough time is spent on the seriousness of his endeavors, not the impact it had on the community or art world, but his dedication to scholarship and the time spent in preparing himself for the opportunity. I think he was taught that early on at Howard. And, as they say, you can't determine whether you'll have opportunity, but you can determine whether you're prepared for opportunity. And I think David was prepared for opportunity. Emily, would you like to speak to that question about sort of elements or or aspects of David's personality, teaching or mentoring that were transcended and that has remained with you?
Well, absolutely. I mean, he was obviously a wonderful mentor. I think that as a student, you learn from the people that you really admire as instructors, and then you try to carry that on as as an instructor myself. One of the things, I mean, everybody's already said was so welcoming. He would invite us to his house and make, all that kind of wonderful stuff. And it was, not many teachers would do that. He had this incredible sense of calm. That's one of the things I always think about. He'd always come up, like when I'd see him at a opening, give me a big hug, but the calmness and the way he carried himself. And I think that's important to carry through to students as well, is to have this kind of, even keel. I mean, there's a lot of other things I could say about what I bring into my own teaching with him, which is experimental approach, things like that. But, he just classy guy and just always welcoming to everybody. And I think that's so important. Made everybody feel important.
Excellent. Tuliza, how would you respond to my question about aspects of David's teaching or mentoring and practices as a curator, and how it has this ability to be carried forward to your own practice? Tuliza, did I lose her?
No, I'm here. I'm sorry. My mic was on mute. I want to say that I agree with what everyone has said so far about David. And I think that one of the most interesting parts of his personality was his fearlessness. He tells a story all the time, or told the story all the time, about how when he went to college, he just showed up. He wasn't scared. He didn't have an application. He didn't know the proper procedure, but he came. And I can't imagine how scary that might be from a young country boy headed to a big city to enroll in college and stick it out. And I think that throughout his life that I've known him, I've never heard him say, I don't think I can do this, or this may be too much for me. And he had this confidence and fearlessness that I embraced as well. So I know that I have taken on tasks, which maybe I should have been afraid to do, but did it with a sense of fearlessness. And he instilled that in me. He gave me the confidence I needed when I was a poor Southern student coming up to University of Maryland to study with him. And the time he spent with me and telling me that I can do it, sometimes even when I thought I couldn't, was, I think, really wonderful about him.
So that motto that if he could do it, you can do it, so to speak,
Yeah, instilling that confidence in you.
Yes,
To the
absolutely.
point where he didn't have to do it eventually anymore. But I think he did that to so many people.
He didn't seem to covet and hold and keep that opportunity from anyone. He was willing to share it with you, because it was an endless capacity, that he had a gift, he had talent, he had a calling. He didn't have to marshal it and contain it and protect it and compete with others. I mean, he was very open and secure about his abilities and his willingness to share with others. So I agree with you.
And that's what his mentors did for him.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, he just carried on the tradition.
Oh, okay. Jefferson?
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on what everybody else is saying. I mean, everyone has been so spot on. I think what Emily was saying was what I was going to mention, was just his kind of biorhythm, just how he walked into a room. It wasn't like he walked into the room. It's like he kind of floated in. It's like, it was such ease that we would go from his studio space in which, my hands were dirty, and then we'd go to an opening and there would be 500 people there. And then in these moments, you'd be reminded of his greatness, because in the studio, he wasn't thinking about that. In the studio, he's thinking about the work. And when he arrived to that space, he graciously met everybody. And I really, for the first time, understood what the saying Southern gentleman,
Yes.
what that was all about. So I think this is connected to a particular kind of modesty, that you could be a superstar, but you don't have to let everybody know. If you do the work, they're going to find out. And I think that was very much about him. And I think probably something that that I've mentioned before, but just the power of collecting, of holding on to things, to holding on to important things that, you'd walk into his home and, there's a print by, Rembrandt, and you're like, how did you get this, Dr. Driskell? And he's like, well, I got it at a thrift store, or,
Right.
huh? Anyway, so yeah, those are some of the things.
I asked him once especially about the collection, the archive collection at the Driskell Center, who keeps all their letters and all their notes, I said, David, where did you get this from? I try to think about the correspondence I've had with artists, other things, and I just have it in a folder somewhere. David was collecting for the future. And he said that his teachers told him to do that you gather this material, you hold on to this material. And we are fortunate to have that, because that archive is just fantastic. It tells his story and the story of many other artists. But that again is another kind of principle that I've seen expressed by David that I've embraced my own self. Ellington.
Oh man, there's so much about Dr. D. One of the things, a great story I have is one time we were going over to the University of Maryland. We were in the parking lot that was across the street where the church is. And of course, he's always dressed to the nines. And he goes and he picks some weeds. And then, I didn't think about it. I was like, okay, because I'm used to seeing him in the garden. We go to the school. We end up going back to his house. We're in the kitchen, and he takes these weeds and he starts boiling them. And then he comes out with this whole meal. And what he was making was poke salad, and you had to get the poison out of it by boiling them first before you would cook them. And it was stuff like that he would do that was so magical. And then he'll just start cracking all these jokes and stuff like that. Now, I'm picking back in what everybody has said, and we know how gracious and graceful he was, but he was a very humorous person. And I love, like, there was such a high and low with him. And there was something special about him where he always felt like he was connected to the ancestors. It was always this connection of Africa. And when you go in his house with all the art, the African art, the paintings, all the books, it was just this very in-depth aura about him, about his family, and just his environment of the way he the way he lived. His lifestyle was extremely holistic, and it just felt pure.
Yeah.
And the way that he shared it with everybody is, what can I say? We're a testament to all of that.
Like you said, he'd wear those Italian leather shoes and the silk ties,
That's right. Break out with a fur coat.
Yeah. But you had to watch those dishes he was making, though. Rodney would warn me all the time. Don't eat it, Curlee. Don't eat it. You don't know where he got that stuff from. And we'd travel sometimes, and he would say he could speak 7 languages. He was barely he couldn't do Spanish. You imagine that. He's Chinese, Portuguese, Chilean, whatever you could speak, David knew he could speak it. And he couldn't do it at all, but he would destroy it, But
that was the humanitarian in him.
Yeah, no question about it. No question about it. One thing that has been occurring to me throughout these virtual talks about David, and not only that, the articles about him, and the recent HBO documentary Black Art: Search of Light, this show that was this film that was put together originally to celebrate Thelma Gooden's show, The Black Male, but quickly it was clear to everyone that the work that David had did with 2 centuries of Black art was at the foundation of this practice and had to be celebrated. But something that I'm want to get your response to or reflection on. When we think about the role that he has played and is continually being celebrated for that role, how have we evolved from that? How have we built on that? How have we opened the door with that and arrived someplace else based on that foundation? Can you speak about that? And I'll let each of you sort of decide how to speak about it rather than call out your names. But I want to think about a little bit where we're going with this, and we can continue to describe it, but what does it lead us to?
Well, I think when you look at what Mark Bradford has done, he's created institution, Titus Gafar, Amy, Cheryl is working on one, Theasta Gates, of what he's doing out in Chicago. I mean, there's so many artists now that just aren't practicing their work. I mean, there's a certain type of responsibility of putting our history on our shoulders and then moving it forward, but then sharing the wealth with the community. And I think David was a part, Dr. Driskell, excuse me. I think he was definitely one of the founders of doing that. I mean, just the same way he built off of what Herring and Porter were doing at Howard, you know, or what Bearden was doing with Spiral. So he was, I think, and he wanted his mentors, he wanted his students to carry that forth. I mean, I remember him having several talks with Jefferson and I, talking about the mission of what the African-American art world needs in the world. And I think that we are pushing it forward. I mean, the amazing things that I'm seeing across the globe is totally different than when I graduated from University of Maryland.
What would you like to see that's not present as a part of this evolution of that movement?
Well, I think the next thing that we're going to have to consider moving forward is the technology aspect of it. I think this whole thing with NFTs and the way that's going to affect the art world with this huge sale at Christie's, that's one aspect that has to be considered. I mean, whether you're against technology or not, it's just the wave of the future. So it's going to have to be incorporated with everything that we do if we're going to survive as institutions. Of course, there needs to be more of the community involved with art. I mean, it's amazing still how so many of my friends who are educated have no idea what's going on in the art world. It's like totally, completely two different planets going on. And so I would like to see more of the art world being shared in the educational spaces of, you know, people in high school, junior high, so forth and so on.
Let me ask you, I'm going to direct this toward Jefferson. Can you speak about the marketplace a bit, Jefferson, based on how it is relating to African Americans, artists?
Yeah, I can say that there are opportunities present that haven't been present before. That doesn't mean that we've arrived, but I am thinking that because of the work of Dr. Driskell, I feel like there are artists that are better prepared. I mean, there are role models because of Dr. Driskell and going through his slides. I all of a sudden I was like, I know how someone can make a living in this profession, and that was so important to me, and I think important to so many others. And I think that's where he had such an incredible impact. Is he was leading the way. He was encouraging you. He's like, no, you don't have to be a broke artist. There are ways and channels and for you to make a living at this. And that's so empowering as an artist that's coming up, or even somebody like myself who wasn't even a fine artist when I met him. I was an actor, and I was thinking, you know, in some way I was tired of auditioning, and Dr. Driskell's like, you know, stop the audition, come in here, make some work, and don't stop doing what you're doing. Like you were saying earlier, he was an enabler or an empowerer. So it wasn't about me doing what Dr. Driskell was doing, even though I desperately tried for a while. I think he recognized that I had to be me and I had to pursue my interest. But he challenged me to do it with his discipline, and as he would call it, a priest-like calling. And that was the challenge. It's like, could I do what I do like he's doing what his work is all about? And that's how he was a great role model for me.
Excellent. I'd like to present this other question to Adrienne, Tuliza, and Matthew. It's about David's experience and practice as a curator. When you think about your curatorial practices today, I don't know if the argument is still present that you are arguing that this work is important and should be displayed, but choosing what work is to be displayed by these artists, choosing those artists. And how the choice of those artists define their careers and define the canon, possibly. Can you talk about that a little bit? That might be too general, but I want to leave it open enough for you to interpret it any way that you like. You want to start with that, Tuliza?
Yeah, I'll start up with the idea of a canon. 2 centuries of Black American art was really important in the sense that it brought to the forefront a number of artists. Many of them were well known. Some of them were lesser known, and I would say a majority of them were not at the forefront in the larger white art world. And he talks about, in that video, you're talking about that video that came out on HBO,
Sure.
he was talking to Tom Brokaw about the fact that he has to separate this art into Black American art because otherwise it would not be shown. And I think for my curatorial practice, what I took away from that is you still, even when we put that gallery together in 2016, there were still many, many artists that were well known within an African-American context, but had not been recognized by the larger art world. And that work still needed to be done, unfortunately. But in terms of my curatorial practice, I make it a point to not just choose artists that the mainstream art world says are important, but choose artworks that we've always treasured. These artists are not people who are being discovered. They're not people who've been ignored. They've just been ignored by a certain segment of people. And so I think that his bravery in putting that artwork out there and bringing it to an audience that had never seen that before was really the beginning of these larger art museums purchasing that work. And I think at our museum, we still see that. We still see people coming into that gallery and discovering artists that they did not know exist. And that work still needs to be done. So even though we're at a point now in our culture where people are paying more attention to artists of African descent, there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think that community is important in understanding what artwork resonates with Black people and sort of bringing that up. It's a really important thing that David taught me throughout my career.
Adrienne, could you continue with a response to that question?
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the question you asked before about where are we going now? What have we learned from this his practice? But so like one of the things he always talked about was making sure that African American art was part of American art, was fully vested and fully incorporated into that. And it is becoming more like that. You'll walk into a gallery now and you will see in a mainstream gallery, it might be a gallery about modernism, and you'll see a Black artist sprinkled in there without calling them out or without segregating them. But what's interesting about Driskell is he's kind of straddled the line, because he talked about making sure African American art is incorporated, but often we also did things like establish a Driskell Center so that we could separate it and support it, because it still needs to be supported. So we kind of we still have that balance, but because of his work, you see that going on all around. Now, I don't remember the second question you asked, but one of the things that I do think that is important about what he taught me was, like Tuliza said, making sure you bring in artists, not being afraid to bring in somebody new and somebody unproven, and understand that what you're doing might change the trajectory of their career. But you also have to be concerned with, quality and all that other stuff. I mean, there is such a thing, but and not being afraid to make decisions, based on those kind of being, looking at what you're doing, but also bringing in new voices, I think, is extremely important.
Great. Well, Matthew, again, the question is to consider some of the curatorial practices that, of course, built on David's work and study, but also how those practices have changed. And as someone that is really kind of close to David's motto as an artist and scholar and curator, can you speak about that a bit?
Yeah, I was thinking, as you mentioned the HBO film, they talk a little bit about the sparring match he had with Hilton Kramer in that film. And I love some of the stories that Dr. Driskell will tell me about that, and they're back and forth. And he told me later on, years later, that he was at an event and his name was mentioned, and he sees this head pop forward like that, and it's Hilton Kramer, seated a little bit further down from him, and they, have this moment of recognition. It's been a few years since we had this public spat, but anyway, I think, as was alluded to by both Adrienne and Tuliza, I think he was very aware of that there was a little bit of a double-edged sword of having this category, that it was important because it was being ignored. And he would tell me about lectures that he would give, and there would be prominent curators who would come over after the lecture and say, I didn't know any of this. I didn't know any of these artists, you know, and so he understood he needed to group this and explain this history existed because people just didn't see it. You know, they weren't aware of it. I wasn't aware of it. I knew some of the artists, but working for him was the best art history education a person could possibly hope for. And when one of the first exhibitions that I curated when I became a gallery director was of Dr. Driskell's work and of Jefferson's work. And I was talking to him, I was interviewing him ahead of the exhibition, and he mentioned something to the effect of, you know, this is, you are one of the people who has to carry this forward. You know, this is for all of us to keep carrying forward. And that was really empowering for me to think that I'm part of this too. You know, I'm part of making sure that artists of color, Black artists, are getting the recognition that they deserve. And another thing he would always say to me is, oh, my phone's ringing off the hook in February. Don't people know I'll still be Black in March? And so, as a curator, I always think like, you gotta book shows in September. You gotta book shows in November. You know, like you cannot just be calling people in February. And it's just one little lesson. But I have felt, you know, we're talking about the success that we see right now. It's so exciting. You know, it's just, it's phenomenal following the success of some of the artists in the HBO special. And then to realize, like, I was offended on Jefferson on your behalf. I wanted you in that special. I thought Mark Bradford's not in, there's so many artists that deserve to be in that special. There's just like, and that's exciting. It's incredible. But even where I am, I still experience, like, I'm like, not to put down where I live, but we're still maybe closer to 1975 in terms of like what we're familiar with than today. And so when I bring a show, you know, if I bring two artists of color in the same year, people are like, you have an agenda. And so there is still work to be done. You know, we see this great success, but there's still so much pushback. There's still a lot of Hilton Kramering going on in the world, and we, you know, we can't forget about that too, that what Dr. Driskell did and what his work continues to do is still so necessary. The 2 Centuries exhibition is still so necessary, even though it doesn't maybe seem contemporary now. I found that I had pushback showing work from the Driskell Center. I had a board member at my college tell me, I don't really like this. I don't like this exhibition. And after enough back and forth, I knew exactly what was being said to me at the moment, but finally it just spilled out. I don't like Black art. And I thought, man, someone in a position of power felt comfortable enough outside of this gallery to just say that. There's a lot of work to be done. I have a lot of shows to put together until I see some change in this community. So
that's one of the points I'm trying to get to, is that although it was groundbreaking and helped establish the foundation, I think that argument is still very present and has not been advanced as far as it should be advanced. Because if you take away the market attention and think about the institutional role, that's still lacking in many ways. One aspect that is clearly absent is serious criticism. Now, we show work and talk about work, and we do almost press releases about the work, but very little criticism. I mean, it's rare to encounter a writer, an author, or a critic that's going to unpack the work, unpack the show. And that can mean some negative criticism as well as positive, but it's almost hands off. And I think because it's hands off, we suffer for that because the level of conversation is not high enough. If it's happening in the marketplace, then it must be good. Well, that's not necessarily true. And I don't think Mark Bradford is the greatest abstract artist working today, or maybe even of his generation. I don't know about that. Well, I'm not sure about that. And when you look at the film Black Art, I was in a panel discussion with a group of students at Mount Holyoke College Art Museum, and they wanted permission to criticize it. And their criticism, think about all the artists that were left out that had some relevance, had something to say about this. So I'm suggesting that the criticism is not where it should be. The institutional support is not where it should be, and we still have a long way to go. And how do we as artists, critics, curators, move that forward? How do we do that? That's a question. How do
hard
we
one.
do it? We have to do it. And I think Matthew made not a direct observation, but the conversation has to move beyond, as he said, in his institution, 1975, and perhaps even in the Driskell Center when I arrived was pretty well locked in 1970 also. So we have a lot of catching up to do about our argument about aesthetics and culture and history, not the outside world, but our own arguments.
Well, if I may say something on behalf of the Driskell Center. So I think it's important to mention within the context of this conversation about the 2 centuries and another exhibition the Driskell Center did, which is 50 years, was it 50 years later?
After 1950.
After 1950, which kind of caught up where David stopped. But our fall exhibition is going to be American landscapes. And it's going to be the first show that the Driskell Center is doing where not only African-American artists are being included, but also white artists. So it's going to be 2 third and third kind of in relationship, but it's an attempt to show that African-American artists have contribute, and also engage in a conversation of their contemporary. And I think this is maybe one of the next steps that we can take in order to hopefully incorporate African-American art within the larger canon.
Yeah, and that's very much a Driskell style kind of idea, to think about those relationships. And I think that he would be very pleased about that.
Adrienne, don't you think that's exactly what you did at the Phillips collection?
Yeah, I was working, looking at relationships between African-American artists and, in that case, European modernists. And Driskell was very supportive of that whole idea, because we talk about it, but having them all in the room together is something different. And so how do we move the needle? You get institutions to say, okay, I will support a show like this. And institutions that, in that case, it had to be an institution that could borrow a Picasso and a Matisse. Not everybody can do that. It has to be a kind of an institution at a certain level. So one of the things we need to do is have curators of color in these institutions and engaging not just with African-American art, to have a standing where I could curate a show on European art and to be seen as part of a dialogue that doesn't pigeonhole me. I think it's also an important way of gaining the kind of respect, because I mean, Matthew talked about the people, if you have 2 shows with Black artists, what are you doing? But nobody says anything about the shows with the white artists, so we have to just kind of break down those barriers like Driskell did.
And I think that the public, I just want to say this, I think that the publications of these exhibitions are so important because it adds to the canon. And like 2 centuries, of course, most of us, I don't think I was even born when that show was in 1975? 76. Okay, so I was like a year old. So, but the fact is, there's publication now where I could always go back and read it. I mean, we had to read it for Jefferson's class at University of Maryland. But my whole point is that the fact that you have a catalog with great essays on the work is so important for longevity. Absolutely. And I think it needs to be more of that.
Of my generation, when I was in undergraduate school at the Art Institute, Cleveland Institute of Art, not the Chicago Institute, but the Cleveland Institute of Art, there was only one slim catalog on the bookshelf in the library, and that was a black and white 3-page catalog of Elizabeth Catlett. That was it. Nothing else existed. But I want to make a mention of Adrienne's show at the Phillips. Although it was a shared kind of influence between European artists and African-American artists or modernists, there was something else that was happening in that show that I think was phenomenal that wasn't spoken about a great deal, is the parallel development many of those African-American artists weren't necessarily being influenced by other artists. They were developing at the same level in
Absolutely.
terms of their investigation of the medium and the subject. And especially in abstraction or some advanced figurative work, like Warrington Cole Scott, as an example. These were artists that were resolving issues and investigating approaches and evolving in a parallel way, not always reacting or responding to the dominant culture,
Right.
but evolving themselves at the same moment
Right.
in time in history.
No question.
Yeah, I mean, they were modernists. I said the African American Art Project is a modernist project. It's developing along with modernism. So yeah, absolutely.
And always had been the case. You know, when you're left out, we're pigeonholed to make it seem like we're always being reactionary.
Exactly.
You know, and we've been doing this for thousands of years. I mean, it's in the history books. We just want people to acknowledge what we have brought to this planet over the millennia. I don't think that's too much to ask.
No, it's not. It may not be answered, but it's not too much to ask.
Right.
I agree. So when you think about artists and art historians as well, do you find that now we're evolving to the point of not just collaboration, but a heightened sensitivity to each discipline? Artists becoming more cognizant of art historical movements and practices, and our curators becoming more aware of artistic practices. Do you believe that is, rather than having these different kind of disciplines or separate disciplines, are they merging more than they have in the past?
I think they are. I think that particularly artists are very clued into what's happening in art history and the critique and writing and marketing their art. They're very smart, very, very smart. I see this trend and it's wonderful. And they speak the language and they're able to advance through the career because they are so cognizant of what's going on and know how to work. And I will call it the system, because the art world is more than just history and culture and exhibitions, but it's a business. It is a strong business, and they understand that. And these artists are being trained when they come out of graduate school. They understand it and they're taking advantage of it. And it's really interesting to see.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm going to mention something. We did an exhibition at after 1950 show, traveled, if I'm not mistaken, it was Cincinnati, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Cincinnati. And during the talk, David was there to give a talk. He gave his presentation. At the end of it, he says, you know, these Black shows have to end. Now, we had rented that show to Cincinnati, so I was a little nervous in the audience. Now we rented the show. The museum is committed to showing the show for its reasons, and David's saying we need to end this, you know. I think you mentioned this earlier, it was a parallel concern that you need to show it to affect and address the issues in the canon and the absences in the canon, but you need to end it also. It needs to come to an end. I think you've spoken to me about this also in the past, Tuliza. Do you want to make a comment about that?
Well, I think that point of view is really important. I think that when you're a person of color, you not only understand your own culture or the people around you, and you see that in its full humanity, but you understand people who don't look like you, because you really have to. And I think that in order for this idea of a Black show or an Asian show to end, just because you're grouping people because of the color of your skin, you have to have people who are curating it, who can see past that veil of Blackness and see the holistic nature of that. And one of the things, you know, I was working on my gallery and shows that I do is you listen to the audience, you listen to the artist and what the artist wants and how they see themselves. And if you can understand how they see themselves and navigate through the world, you can better present who they are visually in terms of their visual art production. So I think that staffing needs to change, people's experiences. You have to get out of your bubble. You have to learn what it's like, not always to be in the majority. You know, you need to have curiosity. You need to accept that when you do hire a Black curator, as Adrienne said, that Black curator can do things other than art by Black people. And they should be able to do that. And it'll be richer because of it, because you're coming from a different perspective. And I think that that's really the only way that can change is if you have board members and if you have directors and if you have people in marketing, not only in education, not only just curators who can bring a holistic perspective to the museum, then you could probably stop doing that Black show every 7 years.
Sure.
But you still can do them. I mean, for example, if you were doing an Afro-Cobra show, of course, all of those artists would be Black, but that is actually germane to how they see themselves versus how we see them.
Mm.
You're asking for a certain kind of maturity and accountability, aren't you?
Yes, and people are having to account. I mean, times are changing rapidly and people are having to account for their institutional history and for their contemporary practice. So I'm really interested to see what these younger generations and how they're going to change this art world, because I couldn't imagine this 10 years ago, what's happening now.
Yeah, I mean, what I think what my students are understanding to kind of dovetail on that is that to change their work, they're going to have to change society. You know, it's like until like a Black man isn't pulled over for being Black, you know, you're not going to, the gallery isn't going to change. The museums aren't going to change. There's a connectivity, and people are, you know, finally coming to this realization that if our society is this complicated and messed up, how's it going to be any different when you go into a gallery or museum space?
Sure. Yeah.
It's often worse.
Yeah.
We have a few questions from the audience. If that's okay, I would like to read them. So the first one is to Ellington, but I think to everybody else. Can you say a bit more about NFTs and the direction that you see art headed?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to wrap my head around it myself, because it's, you know, it's still in the nascent stage of where it's going, but it stands for non-fungible token. And what happens is that people are able to sell digital images as tokens which is a cryptocurrency for this image. And I think because we have moved into an age where the 21st century is so much about imagery, as you can see with TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, that this imagery is actually really becoming very sacred to a whole lot of people. And the fact that you can be a collector in that space is what the NFTs are really all about.
And producer in that space too, right? Producer.
Absolutely. And so what happens is a lot of digital art is taking place on that medium. And that's the best thing I could tell you about it now, because I'm still in the research phase of, like I said, wrapping my head around it.
Or do you just said you had another one?
Yeah, another question is, what is the role that you feel collectors have, but especially collectors who are known for other reasons, such as Serena Williams, and how they can encourage and what kind of role they play in conveying the idea that art is important and can be a part of any home?
Well,
Go
on.
I was about to say, well, I think, you know, it's interesting because I hear about Carrie James Marshall and so many rap songs now. And when that turning point of when that happened is when P. Diddy bought that piece of auction on Carrie J for like 21 million. And I think when you have these celebrities that come into the game that are buying art, I mean, because our American culture is so focused on pop culture and these celebrities, Serena Williams, being Architectural Digest showing her collection is definitely going to influence a lot of people to start collecting African art. It's the way that this country works. So it's a good thing for artists, and I think it's a good thing for our exposure.
Sure.
As long as that artwork is respected.
That celebrityhood adds value and status to it. I agree.
Absolutely.
And the popular culture aspect of it. Remember the show Empire and their art collection. That was when I saw it sort of filtering in. And people were just really excited about those artists that they saw in the background of that home.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
We have one more question that is very general. I'll throw it just for a minute. If you can explain what you mean when you talk about digital art. So can maybe Jefferson and Ellington or anybody else? And then I have a question.
Jefferson, I'm gonna let you take that because you were one of the earlier pioneers.
No, it's so broad, you know. I mean, I feel like digital art can be art that is made through audio, a sound. I think it's more a focus on the intersection of technology and art making. I'm trying to figure out like how to begin to narrow this down, Ellington. It's like right in front of my face, but I can't define it. It's you know, I think it's a broad umbrella. I mean, and we think about it. Usually when people talk about digital art, you're thinking about things, you know, from the 1990s to now. Before that was analog. And, you know, not that there wasn't video that was being made, but it was being made differently. And digital now, I mean, it has a different kind of fluency. Like what Ellington was saying is how it can be transferred and moved. And I think what Ellington was talking about specifically is work that's, you know, not in the physical world. Which is fascinating. Sure, why not? You know, I mean, I feel like we're in the 21st century, we're coming to terms that, you know, what art can be. And it's not necessarily narrow anymore. It's much broader, and digital work, and what Ellington was talking about is the newest chapter in understanding the potentiality in the marketplace of art in the 21st century and how it relates to even now us being on Zoom. I've had students that are making work specifically for this platform, and it's just amazing. So I mean, the possibilities are endless. So I'm having a little bit of a hard time explaining. Ellington?
So I would like to bring it back. Maybe that would be the last question or comment for each one of you, but I would like to bring it back to education. Like all of you, I graduated from University of Maryland, and there was, in art history classes, there was nothing about African-American art. I was very fortunate though that one class was offered at the time, which was called Political Black Art of the 60s and 70s, which changed really the directions that I was taking in my studies of American art. So I really wanted to hear about how you bring more, I would say, expanded or education to your classes, like beyond just teaching, you know, how to draw or how to paint, but how do you bring the spirit of David about education? He was, as we know, an artist, an art historian. He was a philosopher. He had so much knowledge in so many aspects of life, even though he was not considered, I think, as a political artist, the same way that, for example, Jefferson, he definitely have works that he expressed social and political issues. So I would like to hear about those aspects of education, and where do you bring it in your own teaching, or I know that all of you, maybe, I'm not sure about Tuliza, but in your own teaching and your own careers, I guess, and maybe that can also be your, you can summarize your last words for tonight. So who would like to jump into that? Adrienne?
Well, I teach African-American art and representations of race. And so that's the basic thrust of what was teaching. I haven't taught in a few years. So it is all about what I teach. So but I would say I'm thrilled to have been here tonight to share some thoughts in the absence of us being able to have a real, you know, a memorial for David, or I'm just thrilled to just share some thoughts. So thank you. But I haven't heard from Emily.
Yeah, I was going to, let's go to Emily and then Matthew maybe, but Emily, and I think in your case, I'm very excited that you are teaching at Maryland, which is the same institution that David have been, you know, teaching.
What I was going to say is that, you know, I still have the books because I took the African-American art theory course, and he would have us go see shows and things like that. Was part of the class. And I have those books, and I also continue to, you know, keep myself relevant with, you know, looking at artists from all different cultures, because at Maryland our classrooms are they're from, you know, students are from all over the place and all kinds of, it's, you know, really wonderfully diverse. And so I really try, I've I go out of my way to make sure that I have a list of current contemporary artists for students to look at, and that it covers the whole range as much as I possibly can. And I think that that's sort of what David, instilled in me, was to always, he educated me about artists that I had not seen. If you look at an art history book, even, up till whatever year it was, there were very few African American or Black artists. And so I make sure to always bring up whatever catalogs I got, and to also include any, current stuff, and make sure that my students know about all the different nationalities and different backgrounds of artists. And I think it's so important. So it's actually one of my really important to me. So I hope I'm doing him some kind of justice with that.
Great, yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Hard steps to follow in, but.
Matthew, do would like to add to that as well?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I teach an art and visual culture class, and I find the way that I use some of the examples that Dr. Driskell taught me is thinking about the way I teach that class. I think about what contemporary issues do I think we need to wrestle with as a group? What's happening in our society, in our culture right now that we need to wrestle with? And then I look for the artists whose voices I think can speak to that the most powerfully, and I show that work. And sometimes it's people I know, like Jefferson's work. I had students looking at the piece he did for the National Gallery this last semester and writing about that in relation to what they were seeing around them. But like Emily, I'm also very conscious of showing a broad range of examples so that, representation is very important. The students are seeing that there are artists all over the world that, that don't just look like a bunch of white dudes from Europe making artwork. That is important. That's super important, and something that I did not really experience that much. I had some mentors as an undergraduate student who, that I saw as living examples that contradicted that. But what I was seeing in my art history classes did not, and I think, so, and then also just, I think of the art gallery, academic art gallery as a teaching space. And so that's another thing. I think of it in the same way that I do the art and visual culture class. I'm thinking what is happening right now, and looking ahead, what is going to be pressing in the coming year. And, you can't always know for sure, but you have a sense of what's going on in the culture around you. And I try to curate with that in mind. What am I going to be talking about? And who are the artists that I want to be the voices that people are hearing on this issue? And that's how I approach most of the job of the curator that I do.
Great. Anyone else? Ellington, Jefferson?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't taught in 3 years. But when I was in the classroom, or even now within my artwork now, I always bring in literature, African-American history. While I was teaching, I always played music. So kids would hear everything from Coltrane to Miles to, all the way up to Tribe Called Quest, so forth and so on, just so like musically they can understand the culture. And also along with a lot of international music, so they get the culture through all their senses. And I will always do in my painting class, I would go through the primary colors. And so I would start with like Egypt. And when you see like the temples of Karnak or Edfu, you would see these primary colors that are being used for the hieroglyphs. And then I would take it to pre-Renaissance to Renaissance, all the way up to modern day of artists like Jacob Lawrence that use the primary colors, and how they mix the complementary colors to surround these primary colors with their neutrals. So the point of the matter is that when it comes to painting or drawing, the elements are the elements, right? And they don't change for anybody, what color you are. We still use the same elements to create a composition. And so when they understand how our culture uses the elements, they can learn to understand where we come from and what we're talking about. But the journey always continues, and it never stops. So that's that was my approach.
Well, is that a good place to stop and come to a close?
I had too much fun, man. I wish it can go on for another 5 hours.
Well, see, we got to have these conversations. We don't get to have them, as often as we should. That's important. And I'd like to thank all of you for participating. You made this very special. And it's a great blessing to have a chance to celebrate someone like David and how his spirit continues to express itself today and will in the future. And thank you for celebrating that legacy with us at the Driskell Center.
So much.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everybody, and have a great night.
Yes,
See you.
Thank you.
you.
Thank
All right,
you.
take care.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. All right.